recording. I'm also going to turn on live transcription, but you can turn it off on your end if you find it distracting. I'm Dr. Alicia Shadaman, Director of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern Illinois University. We're an interdisciplinary center offering an undergraduate degree in nonprofit and NGO studies. We do research in the sector, support nonprofit capacity building, and share the latest academic research. So welcome to all of you joining us near and far. I see some former students coming from across the country. I see some people locally. Our staff and our current students are here. So I'm excited to welcome everyone today. I came across Dr. Laurison's research when I picked up his book, The Class Ceiling, a book that he co-authored. And I was like, well, he sounds interesting. let me go check him out. So he has a great website for all of you, those who want to check out his work, all the research that he's done and kind of what he's engaged with. So I wrote to him and he willingly agreed to come and speak to us. So he's an assistant professor of sociology at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and the associate editor of the British Journal of Sociology. And before Swarthmore, he did a postdoc in the sociology department at the London School of Economics for 3 years. And before that, he earned his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. So welcome, Dr. Laurison. I will turn it over to you and then I'll moderate the discussion when we get to that point.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And you want me to go for about 45 minutes and then turn it over for time for discussion, right? All right, I think I can do that. So let me see if I can share my screen. Ta-da. Does that look reasonable to everybody? Great. Okay. So everything that's on this slide, Alicia already said, but I'll just say again, thank you for having me. I'm excited to get to talk about my work. My plan is to first of all, give you sort of an overview of what we know about the sort of the facts of inequality in political participation, and then some of the reasons for that inequality, including a couple of reasons that I think are sort of the most common ones put out there, but are not complete in terms of understanding why we see that inequality. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the explanations I put forth in my forthcoming book about what campaigns do and why they do the things they do. So that's sort of the plan that I've got. I'm really happy to take questions and have a conversation when we're done. So I'm looking forward to talking with all of you. All right. Okay. There we go. So this is something that probably everyone here, if you're interested enough to come into a talk about politics and inequality, is familiar with. The breakdown of voting in the 2020 election. I don't need to go into it in great detail, but this is how we often see reports on who's voted, on political polarization, on sort of the state of politics in the country. It's roughly evenly split. In 2016, as we know, the roughly even split in the electorate, although Clinton had a slight advantage in the popular vote, resulted in a Trump win in the Electoral College. In 2020, the ratios were pretty similar in terms of the popular vote, but we got a different result in the Electoral College, and now we have Joe Biden as president. So that's all, hopefully not, well, if it is news to you, I'm really glad you're here. But I'm guessing for most folks, it's not new news. What we don't see quite so often is the people who don't show up. So 2020 had the highest rate of participation in the election in recent memory, as well as the highest just raw turnout numbers. It was the first time in a generation or a couple generations. I should actually look up exactly when this might have happened last, but it was the first time in quite a while that the percentage of people who voted for any candidate was actually higher than the percentage of people who stayed home. So 34% of those eligible to vote voted for Joe Biden. That's the blue down here, which is just a little teeny bit more than the 33.9% of those who were eligible to vote who chose to stay home. What's more common, so here's the sort of picture of 2016 without the non-voters. What the pattern has been for quite a while, and we'll see whether 2018 and 2020 turn out to be exceptions or a shift, is that the number of people, the percentage of people who are eligible who don't vote outnumbers the people who voted for either candidate. So this is the percentage of those, the percentage among all eligible voters in 2016, over 40% of people who could have voted stayed home. So that swamps the percentage of people who voted for either one of the major candidates or anybody else by quite a bit. About 60, a little less than 60% of people turned out in 2016, about 66, 67% of people turned out in 2020. So that's been the pattern for quite a while, that there's a substantial portion of people who could vote who don't for various reasons. And I want to talk about those reasons, but first I want to talk about who are those people who stay home. So this is data I just pulled from a census report on voting for 2020. And what you can see is I've just mapped the percentage of people in each household income category who said that they voted in the 2020 election. So down here at the bottom, can you all see my mouse when I do this? Okay, great. Down here at the bottom, folks in households, less than half of people in households earning under $10,000 a year, folks who are quite poor, said they voted. Basically, as income goes up, the percentage of people who say they voted goes up substantially, so that not quite twice as many people in the over $150,000 household income category said they voted as people in the lowest income category, like 1.8 times as many or something like that. So there's a real class inequality in who's showing up at the polls. And this has been the case really consistently in the US as far back as reasonably good data goes. So this is from the American National Election Surveys. It's showing 1972 to 2012, slightly different income categories, but the same basic pattern. For any year, the lowest 10% of the income distribution votes at a far lower rate than the top 10% of the income distribution, that light blue at the top. There's some shifting around, but basically every national election in the US and midterm elections as well, they're just hard to put on the same chart because the rates of voting are so much lower. The richest people vote far more than the poorest people. And that's true not just for voting, but for basically any measure of political participation or political engagement. And it's also true, in addition to being a scholar of politics, as Alicia mentioned with my last book, The Class Ceiling, I'm a scholar of class. One thing that is somewhat annoyingly true about studies of class and inequality in the US, especially among sociologists, is we all have different ways of thinking about what class means. I won't bore you with those debates and those details, but if you read the New York Times, often they say working class, and they just mean anyone without a college degree. If you read sociology, often we will use occupation. If you look at economists and other folks, they often use income. However you think about what class position means, or inequality, sort of in terms of people's resources, in terms of their social position, there's a gradient in political participation. And however you think about political participation, there's a class gradient. So this chart is just to give you some flavor of some other ways of looking at it. And it's showing the percentage of people with each education level who say they belong and or actively participate in a political party in the US. So you can see a very similar pattern. The least educated people, basically almost all of them say they've never belonged to a party, people with less than a high school degree. As the level of education increases, the percentage of people who say they've participated, belongs to a political party, and or belonged and actively participated is much higher. So that gives you another flavor of politics in the US being dominated by the relatively well-off by any measure. That's not the slide it's supposed to be. That's the slide it's supposed to be. You got to have one mistake in every presentation. I would like it if that were not the case, but so far it seems to be. All right, so that's the sort of overall picture of the inequality. that matters, I think, first of all, purely just from sort of democratic principles, right? If you think democracy is a good thing, you probably think that more people participating is better, and that a fairly even representation across the across the spectrum of society is probably a good thing as well. It also matters, though, for how policy is shaped. So this chart is showing, again, across 5 categories of income, the percentage of people, voters or non-voters together, who support increasing aid to the poor, who think we should do more for poor people in the US. This is just one example of a policy, although it's one I care about quite a bit. And what you can see here is that first of all, the lowest income people are the most likely to say, yes, we should increase aid to the poor. You sometimes hear, people complaining that, oh, poor people don't vote their class interests, or et cetera, but you can see that there's a pretty clear class gradient in who thinks we should give more aid to poor people. So there's not I think some of those complaints are a little off base. And you can also see that in every income group, the people who did vote, the blue bars, are somewhat more likely to support aid to poor people than the people who didn't vote. So there's sort of a gradient in participation by support for this policy. We could talk more about why that might be, but for now, my point is mostly just that the skew in participation matters for what kinds of policies people who are participating are more likely to support. All right. Okay. The other, the sort of corollary to the inequality that we see in political participation by class is that there's steep inequality in political participation by race as well. That shouldn't surprise anybody who has, a rudimentary understanding of race and class dynamics in the United States, but I think it's worth pointing out explicitly. This is, of course, for 2 intersecting reasons, right? One is that Black and Hispanic people in the US, at least, less so Asian Americans, are disproportionately likely to be at the bottom of the class distribution, right? In large part because of our country's history of, all the awful parts of our country's history, which I won't do the whole, summary of, means that, Black and brown people have been kept out of, every channel basically for access to wealth and stable incomes, far more than white people have. So that makes the sort of class race intersection. And of course, there's also direct voter suppression that's been targeted, especially at Black people in the US, from not being included in our democracy in the first place in the era of slavery, through harsh measures to exclude Black people from voting, starting right in Reconstruction, moving on through Jim Crow, with some brief lapses and then some recurrences. So there's lots of reasons why we see this race gradient in voting that aren't only about the class intersection, right? That aren't only about class differences between people of color and white people. That's part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. So my focus is very much on the class and the economic inequality, but I think you can't think well about what that is or what it means if you're not thinking also about race and racism and white supremacy in the US. So I try to bring those 2 together whenever I'm talking about one. So that's sort of the big picture. There is a lot of inequality in who participates in the US. There's class inequality, there's race inequality, there's a steep class gradient no matter how you look at it and in every form of participation. That may or may not be news to folks. What I want to talk about in more detail is why I think that is. And there's sort of 3 main explanations that I see bandied. Well, there's 2 main explanations that I see bandied about by other people, and then there's a third that I think is really important and want to add to the discussion. The first explanation is to do with institutions and voter suppression. So this was the argument of a classic book, Why Americans Don't Vote, and a reissue, Why Americans Still Don't Vote, by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward. Their argument was basically elites don't want poor and working class people to vote. It's good for elected officials of all stripes, if of all parties, if they can keep the electorate closer to themselves in class position and so on. And so elites don't want poor and working class people to vote, and they make it hard so that they won't. More recently, Carol Anderson wrote One Person, No Vote, arguing that, as the subtitle there says, voter suppression is destroying our democracy. You hear stories in the news every day now about efforts to increase the hurdles to voting. Voter ID laws, all kinds of attempts to fight quote unquote fraud. Most of them are not designed to address any problem that seems to be prevalent at all, and seem primarily designed to increase Republican vote share and make it harder for people in disproportionately Democrat demographics to access the ballot box, demographics and geographies. So that's absolutely part of the story of why there's such race and class inequality in who turns out to vote. But that was a poorly timed sip of water. Anyway, but I don't think that's the whole story. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But one is that the motor voter law, which was championed by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, seems to have not, it increased. So that was the law that made it so that every time you go to the DMV, they ask if you want to vote. Anytime you interact with a number of other government agencies, they offer you a voter registration form. I think that's a great law. It seems to have slightly increased the overall rates of people who are registered, and thus to some extent the overall rates of people who vote. It doesn't seem to have changed the inequality in the levels of people who are voting. And this is from a study by Adam Berinsky, who's a political scientist. And I'll read you the quote so you don't have to read it while I'm talking. Because levels of political engagement currently follow rather than cross demographic divisions in the electorate, reforms designed to make voting easier magnify existing socioeconomic biases in the composition of the electorate. So basically, when you make, if this is the slant in voting by class, when you make it easier to vote, everybody votes more, but actually richer people vote even more. So you get greater inequality because people like me, and maybe people like many of you on this phone call, like when it's easier, we're even more likely to go to the polls. People who weren't that inclined to vote in the first place vote at slightly higher levels, right? Down by my elbow, but not as much more as people at the top. So you exacerbate the inequality even as you slightly raise the overall levels of voting. And that seems to be what's happened with a lot of efforts, which again, I think are good overall, to increase access to the ballot box. So initiatives like early voting, vote by mail. There's a few studies that show some decrease in inequality from a few of these kinds of innovations, but overall what tends to happen is what I just described. Better off people who are already inclined to vote, but maybe didn't actually make it every time, vote even more than lower income, less educated, et cetera, folks. So the increase goes up more here than here. So to me, that means, it means, first of all, we need to think about other ways to reduce inequality in voting. It also means that the explanation that it's the institutions or the barriers is not the whole explanation. Another really common explanation for inequalities in political participation is these guys, who each of these books is about this thick. It's a set of political scientists, Verba, Schlossman, and Brady. They've written more books than that and articles in various author orders. But their argument is pretty much always, and they have great data on, they do these original surveys. They have great data on the patterns of voting. They show really clearly, again, for, in much more detail than I just did, who votes, who participates, who writes to their congressperson, et cetera, and all the ways that that's skewed towards richer, more educated They don't pay as much attention to race and ethnicity, but richer and more educated and more white people in the US. And so I love their books for the rich data. Their argument is often basically that there's something about having more resources that makes it easier to vote. And that's a logical argument, right? Having more resources makes everything easier. It is very nice to have more income, to have more control over your work life, to have more education, to have, to own your own home, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not sure it's a good sort of theoretical explanation for these patterns that we see. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that if that were true, right, if just having more resources made it easier to vote or do other kinds of political participation, you would expect that that would be true across places and across time. This is a slightly ugly, sorry, I pulled it from someone else's report, so I couldn't edit it. But this is a chart showing levels of voting in the UK across time by income level. So the orange income is the lowest, the orange line is the lowest income level here, the purple line is the highest income level. And what you can see is that, oh gosh, what 1987 is now like 35 years ago. 35 years ago or so, there was basically no inequality in levels of political participation by income in the UK. But something happened, and I lived there for 3 years, so I was sort of interested in this. Something happened over those 15 or those 25 years. I'm really bad at arithmetic on the spot, even though I do quantitative analysis for my work. So, if I say a wrong math thing, just assume I said the right math thing instead. Anyway, over the period of time from 1987 to 2010, where there was essentially no inequality in who turned out to vote in the UK in 1987. By 2010, there was pretty substantial inequality in who turned out to vote. So that it's not a perfect ordering, but basically the lower income people were voting at much lower rates than the higher income people. And that has persisted since then, to my knowledge. So that's one sort of challenge to that theoretical explanation, right? If resources are directly causing higher voting, you would expect that to be true across time. You would also expect it to be true across racial groups. So what this chart shows, this is from this is a figure that didn't make it into a paper I just published. But this chart shows the income gradient in voting by racial group for the sort of the 4 biggest racial ethnic groups in the US, the ones that we have enough data on to say very much about. If you look at the purple line, that's white people. And this is validated voting from the cooperative or collaborative congressional election studies. You can see that there's a serious, sort of the pattern that we saw other places. High income white people vote at much higher rates than lower income white people. But there's different patterns for different racial groups. So what the paper focuses on is this difference between white people and Black people here. The line for Black people is essentially flat. There's a little bit of a slope, but it's not even statistically significant, the difference between the highest income and the lowest income Black people. They've all voted at roughly the same rates. And there's different relationships. We have less data for these two groups, so I say we don't focus it on the paper, but we say there's different relationships, again, for Hispanic folks in the US and for Asian American folks in the US. The curves are not at all the same across these 4 racial groups. And this is from a model, a regression model that has controls for education, for age, for income. Income is the main variable I'm showing, sorry, for education, for age, for gender, I think for home ownership, a bunch of things. So it's not that there's these different patterns are not about compositional differences. They're net of all the things we can control for in this model. Zooming in a little bit on just the Black-white difference, the other thing you can see here is that low-income Black people have predicted rates of voting that are actually higher substantially and significantly than the rates of voting among low-income white people who are otherwise similar in all the ways we can measure. So I think that's sort of important to know just on its own. regardless of my using Verba, Schlossman, and Brady as my straw man for things I like to say. It's important on its own, in part because, again, you sort of, especially after the 2016 election, there was all this talk about, oh, Black people didn't show up at the polls. Why don't Black people vote enough? And this figure in our paper sort of shows that that's not actually true. The Black people are disproportionately in those two lowest income groups that we show here. And if you, the average difference between, if you pool them, the average difference is basically zero between Black people and white people. So at the lower end of the income distribution, Black people vote at similar rates if you pool those two categories, and higher rates at the very lowest end of the income distribution than white people. And it's actually the majority of Black people in the US who are in those two lowest income categories. So most Black people vote at higher rates than otherwise similar white people. Where there's a real difference is at the rich end of the spectrum. Higher income Black people don't vote as much as higher income white people, but that's a fairly small percentage of Black people overall. So again, I think that's important for knowing on its own. I also think it's, it again calls into this question that more resources makes voting easier, right? Or makes it more possible to vote. Because you don't see that among every racial group in the US. That's a story that's true of white people in the US. It's not necessarily true of other racial ethnic groups, especially of Black people. Just to sort of drive that home, it's actually Black women who kick everybody else's butt in voting. This is just for that lowest income group, but you can see that Black women are voting, about 60 to 63% of Black women in the lowest income group in households earning under $30,000 a year report voting. Or no, this is validated voting, sorry, not report voting, actually voted. The people who did this study went and checked the names of the respondents against voter records. Aside, lots of studies just have reported voting, which exaggerates to some extent class differences, because rich people are more likely to lie and say they voted versus poor people. But there's still substantial class differences even when you have validated voting. Did I want to say anything about this? No. So that's sort of another challenge to the resource story. Again, we're comparing across gender people who have the exact same, to the extent we can measure it, the exact same resources. And we see substantial differences by gender. So something is going on that's not only about, if you work a job where you have some autonomy and have to do some sort of tasks where you do research and figure stuff out, that will make it easier for you to figure out who to vote for, right? That's one of the arguments in the sort of resources theory, is upper class people with knowledge economy jobs learn some of the skills that are necessary to make sense of politics. I could say more about why I don't like that theory, that particular bit of it, but I'll leave it at that for now. So next, I want to take you through sort of why, a third approach to why we see higher rates of voting among poor Black people in the US, and also how should we think about why some people don't vote and why some people don't, and what that has to do with class inequality. So I'm going to show you some stuff that's a few quotes that are from a not yet published research project that I'm actually working on for the next couple of years, but we've already done more than 100 in-depth interviews with low-income, poor and or working class people in and around Philadelphia and southeastern Pennsylvania. Many of those interviews were conducted by community-based research assistants that I hired, who come from poor and working class communities and have connections to the people that they were talking with. Ongoing is a silly bullet point, but there it is, it's ongoing. Don't know why that was animated. So here's a quote from somebody talking about sort of her relationship to voting. And she says, "My mother made sure I voted the first time, when I turned 18. She said, this is civil duty. It's just something you've got to do. We just do it and that's it. And that's what I told my kids. It's very important for them to vote because the things we want to change, we can't change if nobody's voting. So that's a woman named Bernice, who we interviewed. And that sort of quotation illustrates or sort of epitomizes the way a lot of poor and working class, especially Black people, although other folks as well that we talked with, think about voting. It's a moral duty. We also had people saying, you know, my grandma fought for the right for me to vote. How could I not vote if my grandma fought for that right? That sort of thing. You know, voting isn't about how easy it is. It isn't about any of these other factors. It's a duty. You just do it. You figure out how to do it. That's your job. There's a, I'm going to not remember the author, so I'm not going to tell you this book. But if you ask me the Q&A, I'll come up with it. There's a number of books about Black people's relationship to politics in the US that sort of make this point that there's a sort of historical, familial sense of the phrase that's often used is linked fate, that, you know, this is a responsibility that people have. So I think that's part of the story of why we see a different pattern among Black people than we see among white people, and such high rates of voting among the least well-off Black people in the US, high relative to white people at least. So that's part of the story. But I think more broadly, the way we should understand who votes, who participates, who engages in politics is about who feels like politics is something that makes sense to them, that's meant to include them, and that sort of they can speak the language of. So here's some pictures from the last election. And, you know, when I look at these, and probably when most people who are at this talk look at these, apologies again if anybody's here that I'm making incorrect assumptions about, you could say a lot of things about these two people, right? You could say a lot of things about what policies they represent, what kind of ads they showed, what they said in the, at least, you know, maybe it's a little fuzzy now, a year and a half later, but what they said in the debates, what they said in, you know, what they said in their ads, what kind of people support them, et cetera, et cetera. I think for many people, and this might be a slight exaggeration, but not as big of one as a lot of people think, comparing these two folks is something like comparing these two paintings. So I was raised in a family where we never went to art museums or talked about fancy art. My mom kind of thought fancy art was a unappealing bourgeoisie thing that we shouldn't engage with. And so I believe, I actually don't remember, I'm pretty sure one of these is by Manet and one of these is by Monet. I went and found them, but I honestly couldn't tell you which one right now. Some of you probably can. And I couldn't tell you very much about, you know, I could tell you what I see when I look at the two paintings and compare them, but I'm like, they're both boats, they're both water, they're both got some blues and some greens. That's not the sort of things that that you would expect someone who maybe had taken an art history class or grown up going to museums to talk about when you see these paintings, right? So that's one example. Academics tend to be the kind of people who are familiar with fancy art. So let me give you another example. Here's some sports logos. I know the Eagles are our football team in Philadelphia. I can't remember which football team's logo I put over there. Maybe the Patriots. It seems patriotic. But again, that's about the extent of my connection to football. I know it's a sport. I know a lot of dudes are into it. I know people have really big feelings about their teams. And I don't get it, right? It's not something that calls to me. It's not something I was raised with. It's not something that seems important to my day-to-day life. And I know for sports fans, that's bananas, right? How could you not care? How could you not know what day the Super Bowl was? How could you not know who won the Super Bowl? Do you live in a cave? And again, I think there's an analogy here between how I feel about sports and fancy art and how a lot of people feel about politics. Right? It's something that other kinds of people do. It's something that's not designed for them. It's something that they may not be invited to. It's something that's not really in their social networks. And I think that's part of understanding why we get such class gradients in political participation in this country, and why some people feel so disconnected from politics. There's a great book by a woman named Meredith Rolfe, who's a political scientist, who sort of showed that part of the that a big part of inequality in political participation really just has to do with the social networks of different sets of people. Richer people are more likely to be socially connected to people who are involved with politics. So let me show you a little bit more about what I think that means. So this is another interview from the Pennsylvania Participation Project. I'll take a sip and let you look at it for a second. So we asked everybody, who do you think is the kind of person who participates in politics? And we got a lot of answers like this. So this is Joe, he's a white security supervisor who says he never votes. He says, I just imagine someone who wears a suit all the time. Very clean cut looking person, I'd imagine. I wouldn't imagine an average everyday sort of person being very involved. And then this is what the second answer is what, and also what a lot of people said. We asked, why are some people involved? And he said, I think it's just what interests them. If people are really interested in something, they follow it. Like I could tell you about video games because that's what I like. We heard a lot of quotes about this. Somebody else said shoes. Somebody else said shopping. You know, we all have hobbies. Some people's hobby is politics. My hobby is something else. And that's how a lot of people viewed political engagement. There's another great book by a political scientist named Eaton Hirsch called Politics is for Power. And he makes the argument, sort of the flip side of the argument, that a lot of well-off people in the US see politics as essentially a hobby. And we tend to follow it by knowing who's running, by arguing about strategy, by debating on Twitter. We don't tend to engage in it, as many of us, as a struggle over power with actual organizing and working on the ground with other people. So, you know, there's some truth to people's view that politics is a kind of hobby for a lot of folks. Here's somebody else answering this background question. She's talking about politicians, not people who follow politics, but has a very similar answer. A majority of them are from backgrounds that, you know, like they had a silver spoon in their mouth. They already had parents who had plans for them. They already had accounts for them, money for them set aside. So she, you know, she has the impression, and it's entirely correct, that people who are politicians are very disproportionately from well-off backgrounds. Nick Carnes has a couple of books. I'm blanking on their names at the moment, but he has a couple of books. I can find them for you again if you want, where he shows that politicians almost never have jobs before they run for office that are what you might consider working class jobs. They almost all are doing, you know, a lot of them are lawyers, CEOs. They're almost never doing anything with their hands, anything in retail, etc. So she's not wrong about this. Another piece of the story, though, is not just that people have the impression that it's for other people, it's that campaigns are not reaching out to poor and working class people as much as they're reaching out to rich people. So this comes from campaigns believe that it's not worth trying to mobilize people who've never voted. And people who've never voted are disproportionately lower income. So they spend their energy on people who at least occasionally vote. And that means that those richer people get contacted by campaigns more. People who are contacted by campaigns, it's actually the only thing that studies of what gets people to vote or what changes elections consistently shows makes a difference. That was an awkward sentence. Let me say that a different way. The only thing research consistently shows affects how likely someone is to vote is whether or not they've been contacted by someone and asked to vote. Ads don't make a very big difference. Mailers don't make a very big difference. An actual other real human being saying, hello, I care whether you vote or not. And it turns out it doesn't make a big difference what they say. They just have to, you know, appear to care that you vote. That increases the chance that somebody votes. So campaigns are mostly contacting people who already vote at least occasionally. That increases the inequality in voting again, right? There's an article by, I didn't put the site on the slide, but there's an article by Ryan Enos, Anthony Fowler, and Lynn Vavrick that makes this case, that the GOTV, the Get Out the Vote efforts of campaigns, actually increased inequality in voting. And you can see that here, the richer somebody is, the more likely they are to report that a party contacted them and asked them to vote in the 2016 election. There's also a small but not insubstantial racial difference here. White people in each income bracket were a bit more likely to be contacted than Black people. So that's part of that, those campaign choices, in addition to people's perception that politics is a game for rich people. Politics actually makes the choice to pay more attention to rich people. Campaigns make the choice, and they're not, generally speaking, sitting back and going, we're just going to contact the rich people. They're going, we're going to contact the occasional voters, because that's where we think we can get the most yield from contacting people. But what that does is increase inequality in who turns out. These guys aren't making that gesture at each other. They're just two images that I found that sort of get at a lot of what I have to say about who's running campaigns and how they think about their work. So that's Rahm Emanuel on the left and Karl Rove on the right, two well-known politicos. And I want to tell you a bit now about some of the stuff that's in my forthcoming book, where I'm looking at, I interviewed a bunch of people, neither of these two, but a bunch of people you might have also heard of, and a bunch of other folks who work in campaigns. And I also constructed a database of the career trajectories, the race, the education, the gender, the age of all the people I could find who have worked in high-level campaigns since 2004, but with their careers going back well before that. So that's the cover of my book. It's very nice. And what I found about who is doing politics is that they're really distinct from regular people. I mean, they're really distinct from regular people, from people, from the country as a whole, in a whole bunch of ways. One of those is absolutely the racial makeup of people who work in campaigns. So these charts show the percentage of each of these groups that are in each of these racial groups. So about 60% of US adults are white. Voters already are unrepresentative, as sort of the flip side of what I showed you before. So people who vote are about 70% white, or about 70% of people who vote are white. Democratic voters are actually even slightly less white, more people of color than the US as a whole. So that's the third column here. But Democratic staff do not look like Democratic voters. So this is people who work in major campaigns in 2020. And they're about a little less than 70% of them are white, which is a much higher rate of white people than Democratic voters as a whole. Republicans are disproportionately white, but even it's a small difference, but even compared to Republican voters, Republican staff are whiter. So the staff of campaigns do not look racially like the people, even in their own parties, let alone the whole country. I think even more stark in some ways is the difference in education levels. So here, blue is people without a bachelor's degree, and pink is people with a bachelor's degree or more. So only about a third of people in the US 25 or older have a bachelor's degree. Slightly higher percentage of people who voted have a bachelor's degree. Oh, something odd has happened with that bar, but anyway. Republican voters are, in terms of education, not that different from the population as a whole. Democratic voters are much more likely to have a college degree. But what's really interesting, I think, here is when you compare voters and staff within each party. So almost only about 10% of Republicans in again, in high-level campaign positions, didn't have a college degree that I could find evidence of. And less than, even less than that among Democratic campaign staff. So, the sort of one measure of class position or class background is certainly college degree. People are really unmatched to the population as a whole if they're working in a campaign. When you look at what colleges people went to, though, the distinction is even bigger. This is let's start with adults here. So the little gray line up here is people who went to Ivy League colleges and universities, Harvard, Yale, et cetera. And then the green bar is colleges and universities designated elite. I think my campus is one of those. Northwestern, other sort of exclusive, but not formally Ivy League. And then highly selective. So taken together, only about 15% of people in the US with a college degree went to one of these fancy schools. However, taken together, so that's the green, gray, and purple together. 60% of Democratic campaign staff in the US went to one of those, of the ones I could find their college, which is most of them though, went to one of those kinds of fancy schools, and 35% of Republican campaign staff. The household income of people who went to one of these, went to one of these fancy schools is on average about $150,000 a year. The household income of people in the US overall, the median is about $67,000 a year. So there's a huge, we can't know for sure. I couldn't find, exactly what the household income of the family growing up of campaign staff was. Would love to know it, but that's not something I could get access to. But I could make a sort of ballpark guess, right? The majority of them went to schools where people were earning, where their families were earning on average $150,000 a year. The median income in the US is less than half of that. So there's a real gap in the class origin to the extent that I can figure it out of campaign workers versus everyone else. Never mind that they're also, if they stay in the work long enough, making far more than most of us are making. I'll say one more thing about, actually, I'll stay on this slide and say one more thing. There's lots of other ways that they're really different from regular folks. Almost everybody who works in campaigns is somebody who got really excited about politics when they were 12. Or at least when they were 16 or 18 in college. A vast majority of them majored in political science. When I talk to them, they talk about, working on their first campaign in high school or in college. They've almost all worked in politics exclusively since they were, very young. So we talk about in academia, we talk about sort of the ivory tower and how cut off some of academia is from the rest of the world. Many of us at least had a couple years between undergrad and grad school where we were doing something else. Political workers, politicos, even less than academics have been sort of, or even more than academics, have been sort of cloistered in this world of politics for their whole careers. There's other ways they're distinct, they're disproportionately men, et cetera, but this is, the point is, they're really sort of highly selected group of people that are not that connected to the rest of us. And I think that shapes, and then I'll wrap up in a second, but I think that shapes, my argument is that shapes how they make choices about what kinds of things they do in their campaigns, who they contact, how they understand voters, et cetera. This is from 2012, but it hasn't changed very much. I mentioned that the most effective, the most well-researched effective way to get people to the polls is by contacting them directly. That's the category here called fieldwork, maybe also the phone category. Almost all the money in campaigns, though, flows to various sorts of ads. So there's a lot of sort of head scratching among many political scientists about, why are they spending so much of their resources on something that hasn't been shown to be that effective, persuasive ads, versus the things that have been shown to be effective, talking to people directly. And I think part of it is, if you think back to that slide where the two guys were doing this at each other, part of it is because campaigns are so sort of isolated from regular people and so much of what they do, a lot of politicos understand their work as less about, like I asked them, what makes somebody good at politics? Most of what they said was about sort of competing with each other rather than connecting to voters. So they see the work as a sort of competition among themselves, not to the exclusion of thinking about what it takes to win or to the exclusion of thinking about how to influence voters, but their sort of primary thing they're thinking about and feeling when they're running campaigns is how people around them are reacting to them. That's also because it's, to their credit, it's really hard to figure out in any given moment, what is the thing that's going to be most effective, what's going to make the most difference, what ad should we run, et cetera, et cetera. So they rely on sort of conventional wisdom and what other people around them think, because there's not, there is all this research in political science, but it doesn't tell you whether, what your slogan should be or what your ad should say. They rely on conventional wisdom among themselves, but that conventional wisdom among themselves is shaped by disproportionately white, disproportionately well-off, disproportionately well-educated and fancily educated people who've worked in politics their whole lives. So here is a quote from one of the people I interviewed, who's talking about what he thinks is sort of the problem with all of this. He wasn't talking about the race and class differences so much, but about the ways that people are focused more on each other and more on conventional wisdom. He says it breeds institutionalized mentalities and perpetuates this formulaic thinking, which is one of the death knells and part of why people hate politics. It's the recycling of the same bullshit rhetoric on both sides. So if you think about what you see in campaigns ads, it's often "we'll fight for you," or you see, a guy with his family saying, "I share your values." That's like 60% of political content, is those two things. It's recycling of the same bullshit rhetoric on both sides, and it's incredibly stifling to anything that's creative or innovative. He says there's a premium on being safe and conventional in national politics. I think it's ineffective. It leads to mediocre campaigns, and I think it's bad for the larger democratic system. So not everybody I spoke to had this much of a, sort of critique of the world that they were in, but a couple of them really did. And they said, even when we think we should, there's something we could do that would work better, if we think that doing more field would be important, for example, or be effective, if everyone else doesn't agree with that, it's really dangerous to your career to sort of put that out there and try something really different. And so that's part of the story of both sort of what politics looks like overall, and I think the story of the consistent inequality in political participation. Campaigns are focused on each other, and they're disproportionately well-off people, and they're not as focused on sort of regular folks as you might imagine that people trying to win elections in the US might want to be. So that is a tour of my research on inequality in politics and campaigns. And I will stop there, and thank you all for listening. And I'm excited to have a conversation with you. I see the chat numbers going up, but I haven't looked at it since I started. So I'll hand it over to Alicia from here.
Awesome. Daniel, do you want to stop sharing for a
Yes,
minute?
I
And then I'm
do.
going to go to gallery view just so I can see folks. I can see everyone. So, well, if you have a question, please put it into the chat, or if you want to ask a question out loud, you can turn your camera on, and then I'll know you want to do that. But maybe Daniel, to start, you're a sociologist by training. How did you come to this work? Because you're not a typical, right, political science.
No.
So how do you approach this work differently from a sociologist perspective, and what drew you into that?
Yeah. I mean, I went to grad school because I wanted to understand, I don't know how much story you want, but I'll give you the short part. My mom was a Marxist. She thought the revolution was coming, and so I spent my first 15 years of my life being like, "Where's the revolution? My mom thought there was a revolution. What happened?" That's not that question in some ways, like, why are poor and working class people not more engaged in politics? We have this democratic system that has all these ways that it makes it hard for people to participate. There's lots of analyses and arguments, and that's sort of the basis of lots of Marxist rhetoric that, you could never really change it enough, but you could change it a fair amount. Why don't we get more change through the electoral system? Why don't we get more? And part of the answer is that the people who need the most change are the least likely to participate. And so why is that? And so I think, a lot of, I cited a ton of political scientists. I think there's a lot of them who do a lot of great work, but they tend to be a bit wedded to a sort of rational, choicey way of viewing people, that people sort of calculate their interests and or an economistic way of thinking about people. This is shifting some, but especially when I was in grad school, when I started this work, the assumption is that there's some sort of interest calculating that's happening, and there tends to be a pattern of ignoring people's relationships, people's communities, people's feelings, people's sense of themselves and who they are, and people's I'm a big fan of Pierre Bourdieu, although I try not to quote French theorists in public too often. And one of the things he says is that your social position shapes how you understand the world, right? And so a given social object looks really different and that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the art and the football and stuff, right? A given social object looks really different to different people in different social positions, right? The questions that they ask about it, the things they might say about it, all of that is just, it's almost like, when I look at the kind of paintings you might see in museums, and when even my kids do, who are raised by my partner, who did grow up in that kind of world, right? They're raised by me too, but I don't talk to them about art. The kinds of questions you ask, the kinds of things you might say are just really different. And so I think those kinds of insights from Bourdieu and from sociology more generally are part of what brought me to think, are what I bring as a sociologist, that political science sometimes misses or doesn't pay as much attention to as I think is important.
No, and it's great. As an interdisciplinary center, it's wonderful to see, borrowing from other disciplines, expanding what other disciplines are doing in different ways. So Lucretia, you have your hand up. Let me go ahead and you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question to Daniel.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Lucretia Burtz. Sorry that I'm not able to get off camera. I had a question about this notion of, I guess, people looking at things differently based on their experiences. And I feel like there has been dismissal of politicians around this notion, right? Like, I think that the term identity politics has been attacked a lot, right? Folks saying that people are voting based on superficial reasons. And I think it's very dismissive of a lot of voters. But particularly in the Black community, I've seen that there has been a lot of questioning around the Black vote, because we see that, the Democratic Party kind of has the Black vote captive, and Black people do not feel very positive about the outcomes of their vote. Like, they feel like, and I as also as a part of the Black community and as a part of a lot of different organizations nationally and locally, the Black voters who I'm in touch with, we feel, that, yeah, there's not a lot that we get for our vote. And so I'm wondering if you have seen this through your research, that there's dissatisfaction amongst Black voters. And I guess, how is that being accounted for right now in the political climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't, when I talk only about the research I've done, where I've with these interviews with poor and working class folks in Philadelphia, which is, the majority of the people we've spoken with are Black people. I talk about three themes, and I showed you two of them, right? The sort of moral duty to vote, and then the sense that politics is a game of rich people, or is not something that people are invited to. But the third theme is just flat out cynicism, right? They don't care about us. There's nothing that nothing my vote can do is going to make a difference. I mean, you see that even among people who also express that sort of duty theme, right? That I'm morally obligated to vote, but I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. And that, that issue of partisan capture is really important to think about. If there's one party that explicitly essentially hates you and, has no, there's a book, by Hajnal is the last name, Dangerously Divided is the title. And I don't, I wrote a somewhat critical review of that book, but it really makes the point that, Republicans are becoming more and more the party of white people in white identity politics. And so that doesn't leave a lot of options for everybody else. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out. In terms of solutions to that, I think there are organizations that are working to harness and channel Black political power specifically, right? There's Color of Change, there's Black Voters Matter, there's other ones around the country that are trying to figure out sort of how do we get from our vote, our loyalty to the Democratic Party, what the things that we need. And I don't know I wish I was a little bit more optimistic about how likely that is to be successful, but I think that's, figuring out how to take over more of the party that at least pays lip service to caring about your group is part of that. And so I think those efforts are part of that strategy.
It kind of leads to another question. Dr. Julie Langer is a faculty member in public administration, and she's been doing research on voter turnout and trying to work with nonprofits who might be, at the community level to encourage voter turnout, voter registration, things like that. Can you talk about what you've seen in terms of, is that something to keep pursuing? Is it worthwhile, or strategies that maybe they should use?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great book called Mobilizing Inclusion by, I do know the last names of these, Lisa Bedolla Garcia and Mitchelson. Can't remember her first name.
I'm going to include this in a follow-up email because I think I'm now up to like 8 books you've talked about. So I'm going to send this out after. Yeah. Lisa Bedolla.
Yeah.
Melissa. Yeah.
Garcia is her last name. Anyway, it's called Mobilizing Inclusion. They ran experiments with community-based organizations in communities of color in California on Get Out the Vote. And one of the things they found is that you absolutely, despite what campaigns think, you absolutely can get people who've never voted to turn out. They saw a few of the experiments even had as high as 10% increases in turnout among people who'd never voted. So these were people who were registered but never voted. One of the things that was most effective, so they found that what people said when they talked to people about voting mattered almost not at all, which is great because it's really hard to get volunteers to stick to a script. What did matter was how much the volunteers doing the turnout work had in common with the people they were trying to mobilize. So if you had somebody who was from the neighborhood, if you had somebody who was from the same racial ethnic group, those were the two things I think they looked at the most. You were much more likely to see increases in participation than if you had socially distant people. And the parties have to, the parties, people in campaigns have told me that they try to match voters to or volunteers to the people that they're trying to turn out. I haven't seen that when I've volunteered. So that, they have me, I do live in West Philly, but I'm a really white guy walking around the very Black parts of West Philadelphia, trying to get people out to vote. It still is going to make some difference, but it wouldn't be as effective as if they were matching volunteers. Of course, the problem is the people who volunteer for campaigns are disproportionately white, upper middle class, et cetera, just like the people who work in campaigns. So having community organizations do this kind of work, I think, is vitally important and really likely to make a difference and absolutely worthwhile is the short version of that.
Well, and kind of related to that is, what do you think is then the role of government? So public administrators, election officials, local civil servants, to try to improve voter turnout at the very local level. And that runs the gamut, right? The very local, but then also, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, if voter, on those big voting days, whether it's federal or local, that we should pass laws that allow people to either have the time off, the day off to go vote. I mean, things like that. So there's lots of government. What do you think is the role of government in there?
So I do think, I mean, I have to sort of, I have an analytic belief and sort of a normative belief, right? So normatively, I think voting should be as easy as possible, right? There should be a day off. It should be vote by mail. It should be, there should be a polling place easily walkable for every single person. If you go to the wrong one, it should be very easy to figure out which is the right one. They should be well staffed. They should, there should be cookies. There should be parties. There should be, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are great things. I think by themselves, they're not especially likely, from the research I know so far, to reduce the inequality in political participation. I think what matters is, if you're a local government official, I mean, the other thing we know is that voting rates in local elections are even lower than, and off-year elections are even lower than those in the presidential elections every 4 years. So I think there's lots that local officials can do and should be doing to connect with their constituencies, to connect with their, to make make it as transparent as possible to people that what their local elected officials are doing. And what, if you live in a state that's not a swing state, your vote basically, except if everybody in your group decided to not vote, your vote doesn't make a huge difference to the outcome of the presidential election, right? Like I've lived in California for a bunch of years, and it's gone blue every year for I don't know how long. But my vote did matter in local elections and statewide elections. And so figuring out how to make those connections more direct and obvious to people. And again, I think that's the work, that's gotta be the work of community organizations, at least until my dream comes true and campaigns are run by a more small d democratic cross-section of the US.
What are your thoughts, and Lynn asked this, around student residency? When we're in a college town, you're likely in a college town, it creates all kinds of confusion of where students are registered. Do they need to vote in their home districts, maybe where their parents live, versus where they live? Have you seen any of that in your own experience? How does that factor in?
I haven't spent a lot of time on that just because I'm focused more on people who don't have college degrees and aren't currently college students. But I mean, it's absolutely, I do know that there's often efforts to sort of divide the college. Like there's some, like my campus is half in one precinct and half in another. So it's really hard for the students to figure out where they're supposed to vote if they're voting locally, because it's a campus of 1,600 people. And there's some, I don't know the whole story, so take this with a grain of salt, but there's some sense that that was an effort by the county to make the college's votes not influence county politics too much. So yeah, I think there's, I do think one of the many, if I'm sort of dreaming, I would love to see a whole bunch of electoral reforms that would make voting easier and also make people's vote matter more, right? So like right now, Swarthmore students, what they should do is they should go, do I live in a swing state or not? If I don't live do I want to influence the presidential election? If I don't live in a swing state, then I should vote here. That's a ridiculous way to decide where to cast your vote, right? It doesn't seem very democratic or inclusive or et cetera. If we didn't have an electoral college, people would have a lot of a really different way of understanding what their vote meant and how they should think about it. That's a faraway dream, but I think that that's the kind of thing that I think about that could make a big difference for college students voting. College students also, it's hard to figure out. I didn't have a great sense of Seattle local politics as a high schooler, but I certainly didn't have a great sense of Pennsylvania politics or Delaware County politics as a college student. So that's another thing that's really that's tricky to manage.
Dr. Scott Schroffnagel here at NIU, he's done some really interesting research looking at the cost of voting by state. So what do you need to have in terms of residency, in terms of your identification, how easy was it to get to the polls? I mean, all of those kinds of things. So if anybody's interested in that, you can look up Dr. Schroffnagel's research. Department of Political Science is also a co-sponsor today, along with the NIU Sociology Club. And we have several students I know that are part of the call today. When we talk about the cost of voting, I think that's some interesting research coming out of there. So I wanted to acknowledge that research that's coming. If you didn't talk too much about your new book, you want to give us some highlights of your new latest project?
Sure. Let's see what else to say about it. It's coming out, should come out June 14th, although there are apparently supply chain issues in the publishing industry. So there's a little wiggle room around that. You know, and I think I gave you the gist of the argument, and it's also in the subtitle, The Exclusive World Where Privileged Campaign Professionals Make Politics for All of Us. But you know, the other features of it that I didn't talk about so much is there's a bunch about just sort of how hard it is to know how campaigns make a difference, and how that, you know, what the research shows about what campaign effects we can measure and what we can't. And there's also, I think, lots of fun and interesting quotes from people who work in politics about sort of what their job is and how they think about it. One guy called his, most of them, one of the things I argue is that a big reason they're so focused on each other is most of them want to, as one of them put it, like the song in Hamilton, they want to be in the room where it happens. They want to be sort of at the top of the power structure in a campaign, and they want to be one of the people with the most access to the candidate. And so they're sort of constantly jockeying to be seen as the kind of people for whom, you know, who should be in that room. And that's, of course, easier if you're white, easier if you're a dude, easier if you're able to sort of project a certain kind of classed and gendered confidence and authority, et cetera. But a few of them were not so interested in being in that room. And one of the people who I talked to ran his own consulting firm, but he said, I don't want to work on a presidential campaign again because it's just such a cauldron of assholes. I just thought that was a great.
That one's making it in the book as soon as he said it, right?
Yeah, I was like,
that one's
I
going
wish
in the
that
book.
could be the title.
That's
you know,
good.
there, you know, the other thing that's in the book that I didn't talk about so much, but that I think is really important, is that you know, the folks who run campaigns, the folks I've talked about, don't just run campaigns. They also do end up in positions of incredible power in, you know, a few of them are as elected officials, right? Rahm Emanuel was a Politico before he was the mayor of Chicago. Many of them though working in the White House or in senators' offices or in administration. So roughly half of people, for example, who worked on the 2008 Obama campaign, who I could find information for, were working in the White House or in one, you know, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Energy, one of these big administration positions. Roughly half of people who worked on the Obama campaign had one of those kinds of jobs in the Obama administration after they worked on the campaign. And more than half of Politicos overall had some kind of job in government, you know, in a administrative or political role with an elected official or in government at some point in their careers after they'd worked in campaigns. They also end up with jobs like, you know, so I said they're really cloistered, they don't do a lot of things after they've worked in politics for a while, though they do go out into other places. So a bunch of them also have jobs like the director of government relations for Google. So they end up as lobbyists. So there's sort of a revolving door. We talk about the revolving door for politicians, but there's also really a revolving door. And I think that's a lot of how sort of elite power circulates among, for people who've worked in politics, even if they're not politicians and even if you've never heard of them. So that's another piece of what's in the book.
So are you optimistic about where we're headed? We're soon we're going to be in a national election again. I mean, it just seems like, talking about revolving doors, we're going to be in that period of time again. Are you optimistic for the next couple of years, what it's going to look like?
I'm optimistic by nature. I'm more optimistic than most people. I think, you know, I want Democrats to win whenever possible, and I think they need to do some really different kinds of things in order to, I mean, you know, one of the things that's really consistent in American politics is that the party in the White House loses seats in every congressional, in every election right after they took office. It would be surprising to me if that doesn't happen. I think campaigns would need to do some really radically different things than what they tend to do. My book comes out in June. Maybe a bunch of people will read it and go, "Oh, wait." So again, I said I'm a bit of an optimist, but I'm not super optimistic about the next couple of years, unfortunately. But we also know there's cycles in American politics. I do think that, this is not something, every once in a while I feel sad that my book's not about some things that it's not about. It's not really about voter suppression. It's not really about challenges to democracy overall. It's about the people in campaigns. But I think I do think that the incredible increase in making it more difficult to vote, I don't think that's going to be good for inequality in political participation or political participation overall. I'm slightly, I wouldn't say this in broad public because I think those efforts are bad. I'm slightly less worried about it than the sort of news cycle tends to be, because of this research I talked about how making it easier to vote doesn't necessarily decrease inequality. But I still think it's awful.
Well, and some of the research that you showed early on, and I kind of knew that, but some of the research early on was about, college education, and many of us are in higher ed, either as students or faculty members. Higher ed is taking it in the teeth a little bit. The value of college and the value of the college degree in general, cost, and then the attraction of a pretty lucrative job market right now. So, it reinforced kind of what we already knew, but it does make me a little nervous, maybe, or yeah.
I think the political attacks on higher education are, on critical race theory and on accurate knowledge about the history of race and racism in this country, and all of that are really lots of reasons to be worried, despite my
Optimism.
friend of mine called it biological optimism.
Cliff, you want to ask a question? We're getting close to time, so yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
There you go.
There you go. Wait, yep. Sorry. Try again. I was clicking and you were clicking at the same time.
Senior people have a problem with this clicking even. So I want to tell you. So Daniel, great presentation. Was there any could you quickly say, like, there's a 25 and under that I kind of see as a group, and then I deal with a lot of seniors. Is your charts more the center of that, or is there demographics that say how come younger people aren't coming up with an attitude of voting, and why are older people staying stuck with what they've done for 30 years? I don't know. In your charts, it was great to see the pieces, but I didn't know if those two ends of the spectrum were different than the center. Sorry, so go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. Older people vote at much higher rates than younger people. That's I believe that evened out a little bit in 2020, although don't take me too seriously on that because I haven't looked at it recently. So there's, and that's part of why we see an income gradient, right? Because older people earn more on average than younger people. So if you sort of controlled for age, you'd see a slightly less steep income gradient, but you'd still absolutely see one. And it's certainly true that within age groups, better off people vote at higher rates than poorer people overall. So yeah, that's I almost included that, and then I ran out of time to add more charts to my slides. But yeah, that's an important question. I think that there's also lots of evidence. If you're sort of thinking about what we can do, what people could do, there's lots of evidence that if young people get motivated to vote early in their lives, they keep voting. So, if you're thinking about, all of us who are educators, those of us here who are students, anything you do that increases the chance that somebody who's 18 to 25 turns out to vote means that they're also probably going to stay in the voting population throughout their lives. It's sort of, it's habit forming. And so that's worth thinking about too.
Yeah, that's interesting because we see the same thing with volunteerism.
Yeah.
If you're a volunteer as a kid with your family, you're more likely to volunteer kind of throughout your life. I guess it's a lot of those habits are formed so early on that they get ingrained.
Yeah. And part of that is probably also about, I mean, some of the research on voting is, you know, sort of takes into account family origin and all of that, but some of that is just, you know, people from families where that's the thing that's done are likely to keep doing it. But some of it is actually about the effect of, if you can give somebody an opportunity to volunteer that they might not have had, it'll stick. If you can get someone to vote who might not have voted, it'll stick. It's
Right.
also the case that people are much more likely, you know, whatever party people vote for first, they stick with. So you see sort of, or you know, or the party that was that held the presidency when they were starting to pay attention, shapes voting over the life course.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. So I want to thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing some time with us today coming from Swarthmore. I want to thank the Department of Political Science, who co-sponsored, along with the NIU Sociology Club. Emma Hazen is president. So thank you, Emma, for connecting us to that student body as well. I am going to send out an email to everyone who registered today, because I know there's always folks who can't make it to the actual presentation. So you'll get a link. I tried to keep up with Daniel's recommendations in his books, so I'll send you whichever ones I caught when I was grabbing them, and I'll send that out an email, and feel free to share. All of our presentations are on our YouTube channel, so you can always go check those out. And we look forward to seeing you at a future program. We do Real Talk on Tuesdays, once a month, the second Tuesday of every month. And then our next research presentation will be in March. And we'll have an anthropologist coming and talking about basically relief after a disaster that happened in one part of the world. So join us for that as well. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. And thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and turn off the recording.